I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and paying my respects to their elders past and present. I also just want to point out, if you haven't noticed, that we do have a camera here filming today. It will pick up the question and answer session as well. If there's anything that you'd prefer to ask in private at all, feel free to come up to me after the session, and I'm happy to spend some time having a chat with you. Alrighty, well, my name's Ryan Black. I head up the Open Government Partnership team in the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. I've also got Kat Zeminska here with me today from the Open Australia Foundation. Kat is one of the stakeholders who's been working with us on our interim working group, which I'll talk about shortly. And Kat, feel free to jump in anytime during the session and add anything to what I've got to say. I'd also just like to thank the National Archives for providing the venue here today. Alrighty, so today I'm just going to talk through a little bit, before we jump into talking about the Open Government National Action Plan, I just want to talk through a bit of the background to the Open Government Partnership, Australia's process to date and how we got to this point with releasing our National Action Plan last week for consultation. And then I'll just take you through the National Action Plan itself and step through each of the commitments, give you a bit of a brief overview, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. All right, so the Open Government Partnership. So this is a multilateral initiative that was launched in 2011 by the heads of state of eight founding governments. US President Obama and former UK Prime Minister David Cameron were two of the chief instigators, and a range of other countries, of course, that were involved. It's now grown to 70 participating countries worldwide, of which Australia formally joined last year, and I'll talk about that in a sec. The aims and goals of the Open Government Partnership are to secure concrete commitments from governments to promote transparency, empower citizens, fight corruption, and harness new technologies to strengthen governance. So to become a member of the Open Government Partnership, participating countries have to meet a certain minimum sort of standard for, there's a set of criteria around freedom of information and a whole range of other things that governments have to be in place before they can become a member. They also have to endorse an Open Government Declaration, which was established by the Open Government Partnership, deliver a country action plan every 2 years. So this is our first action plan, and then we'll be on a two-yearly cycle from now on. And we also have to commit to independent reporting on progress going forward. We'll talk about that towards the end of the session. In terms of its structure, the Open Government Partnership is overseen by a steering committee. The membership of that steering committee is comprised of both governments, member governments of the Open Government Partnership, and also civil society members as well. So it's a joint government civil society steering committee. That membership rotates, I think, on a 2 or 3 yearly basis, Kat, I think around about 2 yearly basis. Great. And France is actually the current president of the Open Government Partnership, and they'll be hosting a global summit in Paris later this year. Was there anything else that you wanted to add to that, Kat, before I jump on?
No, I mean, I guess you could mention the other things that in that eligibility criteria include financial transparency and disclosures that are relating to public integrity as well. So.
Great.
Sorry, a question. Was there Australian involvement in the genesis of this idea as well?
No, I don't have the list of the 8 governments with me at the moment, but Australia wasn't one of the 8 founding. Craig looks like he's got them off the top of his head. But we can... Sorry.
Even if we weren't one part of the 8, we might have had people involved, but maybe we didn't.
We did not have people involved.
Yeah, so there's...
No.
Right.
No, we're really getting involved. Sorry, go ahead, Craig.
We've had people advocating for it since before it started, but there has no official involvement.
Right.
Great. All right, one...
Can I just ask?
Yeah, certainly, Bob.
Are we a member yet, or will we not become a member until our first plan has been accepted?
No, we are a member, and as a member, we've got a requirement to deliver our first plan.
But I'm right, I know that some governments have had their first plan knocked back.
Not knocked back. I think the partnership itself doesn't actually knock back plans as such. There is the independent reporting mechanism which reviews plans, looks at their quality and provides recommendations on how they can be improved in the future. But it doesn't actually assess whether a plan's adequate. The Open Government Partnership doesn't sort of tick off whether a plan's adequate or not adequate and sort of knock back countries on that basis.
So I had the view that there was a peer review process
That's correct.
that examined this and then made comments on the plan and might send the Australian plan back if it wasn't deemed adequate by the peers.
It doesn't get sent back, but there are recommendations for improvement, and they need to be taken on board in the development of the next action plan. So there are requirements around that the Open Government Partnership has, and then I guess if countries don't take that on board, then they have what's called a response policy, and the complaints that can be made, and it sort of sets in train a range of motions. But essentially, there's no sort of formal approval process from the Open Government Partnership for an action plan. Great. All right, we might move on. So I just want to talk a little bit about Australia's process to finalise its membership. So what you can't see on this screen here at the moment is that the former government wrote to the Open Government Partnership in 2013 with a letter of intent for Australia to become a member of the Open Government Partnership. But it wasn't until Prime Minister Turnbull wrote to the Open Government Partnership in November last year, confirming our membership, that we set in train the development of our first National Action Plan. So we're essentially now in the third phase of consultation on the development of the action plan. So there was a large phase of consultation from November last year until April this year, where there were a range of public meetings held around the country. There was also a formal submission process to seek ideas for potential commitments to go into the plan. And that culminated in a stakeholder workshop here in Canberra, where government worked with civil society members to prioritise and work up potential commitments for the plan, and that informed what went into the plan that was released last week.
Will you go into
who civil society is and who the civil society members are? So civil society, for the Open Government Partnership, civil society is a very broad term. I know that it's quite an unusual term in Australia. I think it's really made its way into the international lexicon, and it's becoming more common. For the Open Government Partnership, they take a very broad view about what civil society means. So they sort of, any organisation or individual outside of government essentially is so business, academia, non-government organisations, the general public. That's their view of civil society. There are other definitions of civil society, which is sort of a more narrow, just sort of non-government organisations representing the views of the community. So there are different perspectives on views on what it means, but the Open Government Partnership Support Unit tells us that they take a very broad view about what it means. So there was that workshop in Canberra. We then went into the caretaker period in the federal election. Coming out of that, we essentially kicked off the establishment of an interim working group where we got senior government officials, and we had an open application process for civil society members to become part of this interim working group as well. It's essentially operated like a stakeholder reference group to help inform the development of the National Action Plan. So we worked with that group, and Kat was part of that group. We worked with that group to identify what were the priorities that we want to cover in this first action plan, and then we talked through the detail of what those commitments would look like. So we're now up to the third and final phase, where we've released the draft action plan for a final round of public consultation before we finalise it and submit it to the Open Government Partnership before the end of this year. Great. So here are a few photos of the interim working group in action. In the top right-hand corner there, we held a workshop with the interim working group in Sydney last month, and Minister Angus Taylor came along and spoke to the group about the group's priorities and its work. So, as I mentioned before, the interim working group, the way it worked, government essentially came to the group with identifying broad priorities based on the ideas that had come forward from past consultations. The interim working group then discussed and prioritised those commitments, and civil society members also raised other proposals for further exploration, and some of those have made their way into the plan. So it was really great having the non-government stakeholders within the room to really push government officials on a whole range of different areas. And I think you can say it certainly resulted in a different plan that we released last week than would have otherwise been the case if it was just government officials working within the room. Kat, did you want to add anything else, just any of your thoughts on the interim working group at all before I move on?
As you described, it was a reference group, and I think that so where we got to was, if you don't mind me talking about that, towards the end of June was supposed to be when we were going to submit the plan originally, and I think we all felt, or a number of us felt, that it was a little bit rushed, the whole process, and the workshop in Canberra was really quite difficult to get over 200 ideas whittled down into a small number of commitments, and we all felt that there was quite a bit of pressure on that workshop itself. So when we came out of the election cycle again and there was a refresh, that seemed like a really positive move, and it was a much more solid kind of way to move forward, because we did have senior people. There weren't really senior people involved in the room in the previous workshop, so we felt like we were flying a bit blind. We didn't know what was going to go in and whether something would come out the other side. But when you've got senior people in the room looking at stuff with you, then you know a greater chance of something flying if it's made it into the room in the first place. So that was really good. Is it the most ambitious thing that could have been there on the day? Perhaps it is. And it being an iterative process, I think, is the thing that's really exciting about this. I mean, you talk about it's a 2-year cycle. It's every 2 years we get to go, well, this was really good. Let's do this bit much better next time. So, and ideally we have equal partners of government and civil society, and it doesn't begin there, but it moves there. So with that oversight, I think it's a really positive process, and it feels like we're at the beginning of that. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely, and it's a really good point, the iterative process. That allows us to look at both the process to develop the plan itself, so the quality of the public consultation that we undertake, how we engage with people in the development of the plan, and also the plan itself and what comes out at the end and the commitments that we deliver. So we get a chance every 2 years to look at improving and building on what we develop and what we deliver this year. Alrighty, so I'll start talking about the action plan then. So we're already starting from a relatively high base, I think, globally. Compared to a lot of other countries in terms of Australia's history in open government. We see this first action plan as an opportunity to build on that foundation. The aim of this first plan is to improve and build confidence in Australian institutions, both within and outside of government, and also to strengthen our democracy by upholding the principles outlined in the Open Government Declaration, and they're outlined here on the slide. One thing I just want to say is that open government is a very broad term, and the Open Government Partnership takes a very broad perspective about what open government is. So I talked earlier, we've got transparency, accountability, public participation, and technological innovation, which covers things like open data and digital transformation. And we've taken a very broad scope to the plan because of that as well. You'll see we've handed out some fact sheets here today. We've got 5 themes with 14 different commitments, and I'll step through each of those in turn in a second. One thing I do want to say about the plan is that the commitments in the plan are relatively high level. A lot of the detail is still to be worked through over the next 2 years as these things are implemented. And you'll notice in the plan that a lot of them have a further period of public consultation built into them. So this isn't the be-all and end-all of the public consultation of a lot of the commitments in the plan. There will be further consultation processes that'll follow up and follow on from here. Alrighty, well, I'll get on with the first theme, that's transparency and accountability in business. And our first commitment here is around improving whistleblower protections in the tax and corporate sectors. So public sector whistleblowers already have quite a lot of significant protections under the Public Interest Disclosure Act, which was introduced in 2013. I think in Australia it's recognised that employees in the corporate sector don't have those same level of protections. And that can really stop people from coming forward and reporting misconduct, from reporting corruption, from reporting illegal behaviour. So what we're proposing here, we've got 2 elements to this commitment. So in this year's budget, the government announced that it would introduce strengthened whistleblower protections for people who report tax misconduct to the Australian Taxation Office. So we're trying to use the plan as a vehicle to take that forward, and we've outlined in the plan some milestones around how we're going to deliver that and up into delivering legislation towards the end of next year. We've also got another part to this, and that's about strengthening protections within the corporate sector more broadly. So the plan commits to consulting on options to harmonise whistleblower protections in the corporate sector with those in the public sector, and that's quite a significant step forward. Second commitment here is around a beneficial ownership register. So for those who who aren't familiar with the concept, a beneficial ownership register shows who ultimately benefits from the activities of companies. So this can help combat tax avoidance and other fraudulent conduct by making it harder for companies to use complex financial arrangements or shell companies or frontmen to essentially to hide revenues and other conduct. So at the UK Anti-Corruption Summit this year, in May, the government announced that it would be consulting publicly on options for a beneficial ownership register for companies. And beneficial ownership is also it's a key priority for the G20. There's a lot of work going on there through the G20 on beneficial ownership across all those countries. So the action plan goes a step further and sets out that we're going to consult and try to settle the detailed scope and implementation of what a beneficial ownership register would look like in Australia. And there'll be recommendations coming forward to government around the middle of next year. Finally, we've got a commitment here around natural resource transparency, and this is all about what's called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. So Australia is committed to, the government announced earlier this year that it would join up to the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. It's essentially all about requiring countries to be transparent and to report on both government revenues and company payments from the oil, gas and mining sectors. Australia has been a really big supporter of this initiative since its inception, particularly in its implementation in developing countries, resource-rich developing countries overseas, where there are a lot of issues around transparency and corruption in the mining and oil and gas sectors. There has been also a bit of a pilot that was undertaken here from 2011 to 2014, testing how we could apply the initiative within Australia. So now through the plan, we're looking at taking that forward and to achieving compliance with the initiative. Alrighty. Our second theme is around open data and digital transformation. This is obviously a significant priority for the government. Already, there's been quite a lot of progress. So just a little fun fact, since 2013, the number of discoverable data resources on data.gov.au has increased from around 500 to over 20,000. So there's been quite a lot of progress in a short period of time. And that really gives opportunities for the public sector, but also the private sector, academia, and the not-for-profit sector to innovate and extract quite a lot of value from this government-held data. And when I talk about value, I'm not just talking about economic value, also talking about social value. And that's something that the not-for-profit sector really emphasises with us as well. Caroline, do you want to speak to that? Has there been an audit so far?
It's been something that's been considered. I don't think there's been a firm decision made at this stage. I think the reason behind it is as soon as you do an audit, it is a resource that is outdated, but it's certainly been considered in government. I'm not quite sure of the actual...
Because we keep being asked, what is the academic demand for data, government data, and it's like, we know it's available.
Yeah.
We can answer that question, but without knowing what's there,
it's hard to, yes. Yeah, that's a really good point. Absolutely. And that sort of goes as well to our first commitment in the plan here. And this is all about sort of taking this agenda a step forward. So we've got a commitment, and this is about taking forward the government's election commitment to identify and release high-value data sets. And through the plan, what we're trying to do is try to do that in a collaborative way with the academic, with the research sector, with the private sector, and with the not-for-profit sector. So there's a whole range of roundtables that we're looking at holding, and I think there may have actually been potentially one already held with the not-for-profit sector. So there's a whole range of roundtables that we're looking at holding to try to identify what does a high-value data set look like and what should we be prioritising our resources on within government in terms of open data to make sure that the data that we're releasing is actually the data that people want. And in the format that people want, absolutely, because high-value data set's not necessarily just about the data that's released, it's also about the quality of the data that's released, absolutely, and making it usable. Yes?
in Australia, a lot of data is not obviously government or private sector. It's sort of intermingling. You look at health, for example.
Yep.
So one of the things that governments can do is set underlying data standards and sort of nomenclature and those sorts of things.
Try to make it a bit more standardised across.
That's right. So I don't see, there are obviously processes involved in doing this at the present, but
Yep.
I don't see that as one of the sort of pillars, and perhaps it would be nice to see.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. And Caroline, do you want to speak to? Is there anything?
There is
Caroline's
work-
my data expert here. That's
There
why.
is work being undertaken on standards in the Commonwealth at the moment. I've been offline on working on this piece of work, so I'm not quite sure where we're up to on the data standards, but we can certainly chat to our colleagues in the public data branch and come back to you.
I'm
Yeah,
from the
that's a great
ACT
point, though.
government, and so we sort of follow some of these international things.
Yep.
A bit in the UK, one of the very good things that they've done is they've actually standardised all the data collection across local government, so that everybody reports to the same codes essentially.
Yep.
So if it's garbage collection, it's got a code. No such thing's being done in Australia. It's absolute chaos out there, and that means that every local council's got different software that talks about the same things in different kinds of names, and
Yep.
there's no economies of scale, and there can obviously be no clear reporting or anything like that. So,
Yep, that's a great point, and it's definitely something we can look at. One thing that I did want to point out with this plan as well is that, it's sort of what we spoke about at the start. It is an iterative process, so where we're starting now isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all of what we're going to do in this space. So that's a fantastic point, and I think it's something that there probably needs to be. It sounds like there needs to be quite a lot of work around. Certainly, if you're
well,
looking
I
at
think it could be
standards.
one of your commitments is 3.4 or something. I mean, you could say it as a sub point under 2.3, but I think
Yep.
it's sufficiently important to identify it as and the Commonwealth, to be fair, has done some good work here on standard business reporting.
Yep.
That's an excellent example of what I'm talking about. Across government, I think there was something like 20,000 different reporting codes for what ultimately was found out to be a few hundred
Yep.
actual things that need to be reported on to government. So that was a process that Treasury took a number of years ago, and it's been a fantastic effort. But it's an example of the whole class of activity.
Yep. Absolutely. I think that's a great suggestion. Thank you very much for that. Kat, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'd also say that you don't actually have to wait for the federal government to do it. If you can do it at the state and territory level as well. So the OGP also has subnational programs coming up. So you could also submit to do a subnational pilot and take the lead in this, and then proliferate that from a sort of more peer-to-peer basis rather than telling the federal government that they ought to tell you what to do, and then they'll probably tell you what to do in a way that you don't want to do it. So,
And a lot of the state governments have insisted that their data has discovery metadata and the ANZLIC standards, so that it's interoperable across. So you can discover what's there. What happens once you get there is a different thing, but at least you can discover what's there using common metadata.
Great.
Yeah,
I'll just take one more question before we.
I
Yep.
was just going to make a quick point on this as well. This is the national government's actual action plan. So while you can definitely put in there things that actually relate to state and local government, the federal government is contingent on the mechanisms it has in place to work with state and local governments. So it can't make commitments for other layers of government through this plan. It can only really make commitments for itself and what it can influence. And that's an important characteristic when it comes to dealing with data sets that are collected by local government, which are state government organisations, rather than being controlled by federal.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Craig, and we'll see a little bit later on how freedom of information, there's an example coming up of how other levels of government are working together to bring something into a national action plan. So that might be something that goes into the next national action plan if there isn't an obvious way to do it here.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Thanks very much, Kat. Craig. Alrighty, our second commitment here is around building and maintaining public trust to address concerns about data sharing. And this is something, it's quite topical, and it's really all about trying to better understand community concerns about data and the open data agenda, and to ensure within government that we have the capabilities in place to manage issues around privacy and personal information. So it's all about building that capability, about starting improving that conversation with the community, and really building on a lot of those, the Privacy Act aspects which really underpin the open data agenda. Alrighty, and our final commitment there is around digitally transforming the delivery of government services. So this is building on the government's existing agenda. So there was recently announced that the government's establishing a digital transformation agency, which is replacing the Digital Transformation Office, and is responsible to lead the online transformation of government services, making services easier for the public to interact with, making them more accessible. So the National Action Plan is reinforcing this agenda by advancing the government's election commitments to develop a digital transformation roadmap, which will set out the priorities and timeframes for taking this agenda forward, and also establishing public dashboards, which will provide transparency around the performance of government services.
Are you working with Data 61 on that?
That one's through the Digital Transformation Agency. I think Data 61, Caroline, you have to remind me, has been evolved. Yep. Great. All right, our third theme here is around access to government information. And the key commitment here is around information management and access laws for the 21st century. So this is all about looking at reforming the legislative framework for managing and accessing government information. So I'm talking about the Freedom of Information Act, the Archives Act, and to a lesser extent the Privacy Act. So that legislative framework has been largely untouched since the 1980s, when government really operated in a paper-based environment. What we're looking at here is, and what we're aiming to do is to move to a simpler and more coherent framework that better reflects the digital era that we work in today. This is a project that will be undertaken by the Attorney General's Department, and it's complemented by a couple of other commitments here in the information space. One around better understanding how the public's already using freedom of information laws across the country. So this one's actually about the Commonwealth working with the states and territories to develop better and more uniform data and information around how the public's already utilising those freedom of information laws. And that essentially helps us provide a baseline and allows us to compare across jurisdictions how those laws are operating. It could also help us compare internationally how we're comparing our freedom of information laws and their effectiveness of comparing to other countries overseas. We've also got a commitment here around improving the discoverability and accessibility of government data and information. This is about all about being more proactive in the way the government makes information available online. So there's a whole range of different information that we're making to look more accessible online, from grants information, so grants that government awards, but also upcoming grants application processes, corporate and annual reports, and being able to better compare them across different departments. Archived records, so the work that the National Archives is undertaking here, progressing that to digitise government archived records, and also the data.gov.au, so which is the central data portal for the Commonwealth, making that easier and more accessible for people to use.
When you say grants, did you include NHRC and ARC in that?
I'd have to double check, but my understanding is that it encompasses all grants processes across government. And that one's actually being led by the Department of Finance. Great. All right, our fourth theme here is around integrity in the public sector. It's obviously something that's very topical, and it's also critically important to the functioning of our democracy. So we've got a commitment here around confidence in the electoral system and political parties. And this is something where we know that there are concerns in the community about some aspects of the system, such as political donations. And change here really requires the involvement of the Parliament. So what the government's done is asked the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, which is one of the committees within the Parliament, to consider a range of matters relating to the conduct of the 2016 election, to the use of technology in elections, and to the framework of donations to political parties and other political entities. So that review, that inquiry is underway at the moment in the Parliament. And as noted in the draft action plan, the government will consider the recommendations of that committee before proposing reforms in that area. So obviously that committee operates to its own timeframes. It is a committee of the Parliament, but we're expecting, I think, a report sometime next year. We've got a commitment here around the National Integrity Framework. So this is all around how do we manage conduct, how do we make sure that we're operating to a high standard of conduct within government and to avoid issues of corruption. So the government's taken a multi-agency approach to combating corruption that involves a range of different agencies and functions. So we've got the Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity and, for example, the Australian Federal Police's Fraud and Anti-Corruption Centre. So what we've committed to is to continue strengthening of that system and to ensure that where the jurisdiction and capabilities of those agencies need to be extended, they can be. It also includes work within the Attorney General's Department to review laws applying to foreign bribery and also to anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing. Finally, we've got a commitment here around open contracting. And this is about government being transparent around how taxpayers' money is being used in procurement and contracting of government services and projects. And while we already have quite a lot of transparency through the AusTender website, which is managed through the Department of Finance, what the government's proposing to do here is publicly review our compliance with the Open Contracting Data Standard, which is seen as the international benchmark for transparency around government contracting.
So what is that standard and how was it formed?
How was it formed?
Yeah.
It's an international standard. I think there's some information in the plan about it, but it is an international standard. It's been around for a couple of years now, I understand, Caroline? Yes? And there's a whole range of governments worldwide that have now signed up to it, to meeting that standard. There are different levels within it that you can meet, so there's different sort of, I guess there's a hierarchy within the standard itself. What we're looking to do is to sort of compare sort of how our current system looks against those different levels within the standard itself. Great. And our final theme here is around public participation and engagement. So we've got two commitments here. One's around the delivery of our action plan and continuing the close engagement that we've had through this action plan, through the development of this action plan and building on it. So what we're keen to do is to establish a permanent multi-stakeholder forum to engage with civil society both on the implementation of this action plan and also on the development of future action plans. So as I mentioned earlier, we do have an interim working group at the moment, but it is just that, it's an interim group. What we're wanting to do is to establish something more permanent going forward, where we've got a mechanism within a group to consult with the civil society, but also look at other sort of mechanisms to engage more broadly with the public. There's a whole range of suggestions that have come through in these public meetings so far around online forums and more face-to-face conduct around the country, face-to-face contact around the country, and those are things that we'll definitely look at. We've also got a commitment here around enhancing public participation in government decision-making more broadly. And this is absolutely critical for improving policy development and service delivery. It's something that successive reviews have highlighted. There's quite a lot of scope for the Commonwealth to improve on. So the draft plan commits us to establishing a new whole of government framework for public participation in Commonwealth policymaking, service delivery and decision-making. So that framework could include principles, guidance for departments, and it's going to be looking at what's already happening within the Commonwealth, what's happening overseas, and what's happening within the jurisdictions, looking at drawing out some of those elements of best practice and piloting them across the Commonwealth. We know that there's a lot of opportunities for better engagement digitally. There's a whole range of exciting things happening within the states that I'm aware of, but also overseas around crowdsourcing within government, crowdsourcing for policy making and those sorts of things, citizen juries and all sorts of things.
Sounds very ambitious.
Yes. So that work will be led by the industry portfolio, but it's not just limited to sort of an industry focus. It is taking a whole of government focus and looking more broadly about how the Commonwealth engages with citizens more broadly.
Not just in relation to this action plan.
Not just in relation to this action plan. So we do have the commitment around sort of how do we engage in relation to this action plan and future action plans. This one's more broadly about how we consult and engage across the whole spectrum of issues that we deal with at the Commonwealth level.
So has anything been written on that, or is this work to be done?
So there is the commitment in the plan. That's what we've got so far. There's still quite a lot of work to be done around that. A lot of other jurisdictions, as I mentioned, have established processes and policies around how they consult. The Commonwealth doesn't really have that. Departments have their own sort of approaches to how they engage and consult with the public, and obviously there's different circumstances call for different levels and forms of public consultation. But what we're looking for is to try to lift the quality of how we do that across the service.
Have you done a review of what other countries do?
No, I think that's the first milestone within the plan. So that'll sort of kick off a bit of benchmarking around both where we're at the Commonwealth level, but also what other jurisdictions and other countries are doing. And that'll form a basis for looking at, well, what do we want to do, and how do we want to take forward, and how do we, what do we want to take forward, and how do we want to operate at the Commonwealth level?
You sound like you might have some ideas around that.
No, I don't, but our Chief Minister wants to do this himself.
Oh, great. Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I know that there's a lot of other jurisdictions already doing similar work in this space. South Australia, New South Wales, I think Victoria have also done quite a lot of work trying to develop sort of new and innovative ways of engaging with the public. Great. We also have another part of the plan which deals with Australia's leadership internationally. This reflects that we already play quite an important role in promoting more effective governance both within the Indo-Pacific region but also globally. And our participation in the OGP can really help us elevate this role and demonstrate good practice. So the plan itself will help, we've acknowledged in the plan that it helps support the delivery of some aspects of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, particularly Goal 16 on peaceful and inclusive societies, access to justice, and effective institutions. What we've also committed to in the plan is endorsing the Open Government Partnership's Joint Declaration on Open Government for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. And that's all about committing to transparency, openness, and public participation in our domestic and international implementation of that agenda. Sorry, Caroline, can you just jump back quickly? Yep. And while our first National Action Plan focuses, it is very much focused on domestic initiatives. We'll continue to support countries in our region to build institutions that promote stability, inclusive economic growth, poverty reduction, and gender equality. Alrighty, just before we get to questions, just want to quickly talk through how we sort of move forward with the plan and what our plans are for implementation and governance. So the Minister for Finance, Senator Matthias Cormann, will be the Minister responsible for coordinating implementation of this action plan and also for the government's ongoing involvement in the Open Government Partnership. He will be supported by the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, which will sort of retain the role, administrative responsibility for this agenda. And we'll be supporting him in coordinating delivery across government. As I mentioned, this is a whole of government action plan. As you'll see in the action plan itself, those commitments, I think, the 14 commitments that we've got in there are led by around 5 or 6 departments, I think. So there is a lot of work to be done to make sure to coordinate implementation and to ensure that there's effective delivery. There are also some requirements from the OGP itself around implementation. So the government's required to produce a self-assessment report, both on the implementation of the action plan itself and how we went about that, but also how we're actually implementing it. And then there's each 2-year cycle, there's 2 independent reports on, as I said, both how we actually develop the plan and also how we're going about implementing them. And as you mentioned before, those plans will come out with recommendations for improvement, and they're things that we then try to take on board in future action plans. Alrighty, so there's the information here on how you can make a formal submission to the process. But I might now just open up to sort of any further questions or comments. Oh, anyone has? Yep, absolutely. We're just going to get the mic going around. Otherwise, I'm happy to have a chat to people after the session as well. Yes.
Hi there, my name is Beth Slatcher. I'm sorry I was late, but you may have covered this at the beginning. You've been using the term we, you know, we all do this and we all do that. And I just want to try and understand again how this is being seen within the current Turnbull government. Is this seen as a Turnbull government initiative, an Australian government initiative with bipartisan support, a parliamentary, you know, to what extent is it a joint civil society government initiative? If you could just walk us through that, that'd be lovely.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is a government action plan, so it's an Australian government action plan, Turnbull government, if you say. But it is a plan that we've developed in collaboration with civil society. So I did step through some of the consultation processes earlier. So it is very much, that is a requirement of the Open Government Partnership. These action plans can't just be sort of, you know, government developed action plans. They have to be sort of reflect the priorities of the community as well as the priorities of government. So what we've got in the action plan are commitments around improving whistleblower protections, you know, looking at reform options for freedom of information and other legislation. Those sorts of things encompass a whole range of things that civil society have been calling for. I can't comment on bipartisan support. I haven't seen any comments from the opposition overall on it. When I use the term we, I think I was talking within government, but also civil society as well, because there will be an ongoing, I mentioned there will be an ongoing mechanism for engaging with civil society on the implementation of the action plan. So I think civil society will play a very strong role in monitoring how each of these commitments are rolling out and providing feedback to government on how we can continue to improve that.
I know that with the Toby Bellwood's group, they've got a lot of engagement with the data champions in each of the government agencies and departments. Are you working with those data champions as well?
On the development of the plan?
And as secretaries?
The actual plan, we have set up an interdepartmental committee on the development of the plan, so there's a whole range of agencies. I think there's about 26 or so that have been involved as we've been developing the action plan. A lot of those agencies have sent their data champion representatives along to the consultations, and they've been engaged throughout the development, particularly with the open data thing.
But certainly with the, like Brian said, with the data commitments, we'll be going through all of those governance groups, so the Secretary's Data Group, Deputy Secretary's Data Group and the Data Champions. I think particularly for the social licence body of work on maintaining public trust, we're going to be working very closely with all agencies through their Data Champions and their Deputy Secretaries.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to hear a bit about the process from here on, because you are inviting submissions. I'm sure you'll have some strong submissions on various aspects, and I have strong views on one area, the involvement and engagement with civil society, which seems to me is very, very vaguely articulated in the current plan, and could lead to all sorts of corruption by, for instance, by talking about a multi-stakeholder development forum. As a critic of where government has got to at the moment with the corporate sector, one could easily see that multi-stakeholder issue being dominated by corporations.
Yep.
So, how open are you to modification of this? And how will the thing be finally signed off? Is Cabinet going to finally give it approval before it goes to OGP, or is it going to be more a process of the independent group listening to what's said and saying, no, we agree with that or we disagree with that?
So there will be a whole of government approval from the Prime Minister and relevant ministers before it goes to the Open Government Partnership, absolutely. Obviously went through that process before we released it for public consultation as well. Just on the multi-stakeholder forum though, just about your concern about it being dominated by corporations, I think you can see with the interim working group that we've established that we we certainly don't have any intentions of doing anything like that. With the interim working group, we've got representatives from like Kat here from the Open Australia Foundation. We've got Peter Timmins, who's the head of the Open Government Partnership Civil Society Network. Ken Cokehill, who's a former Speaker of the Victorian Parliament and a member of Monash University, and a whole range of other people as well. So the idea of leaving that commitment high level within the plan is that we don't want to try to nail down. I think there's a lot of different views about what that forum could look like. If we nail it down now, I guess without consultation, I think that limits our options going forward. What we want to do is try to have a bit more of a discussion around what that forum could look like before we settle on the details. So that's the only reason that it's really at a high level at the moment, just because we do know that, particularly within the civil society network itself, there are a whole range of different views about what that should look like. So we don't want to try to nail it down too quickly, and we might continue the interim working group or another forum in the interim before we establish that. I think we'll look to establish that early in the new year. Does that make sense for you?
Yes,
That's your question. Yeah.
I think my question really relates to how genuinely is civil society going to look on this as being a response to their concerns, and to what extent are they going to say again, well, the usual suspects, the government agencies and the corporations got together and stuffed us.
Well, I think if you have a look at the plan where we've got to at the moment, and I'll look at the what came out of that workshop in April, and I think after that, the Open Government Partnership Civil Society Network, which is a coalition of different civil society organisations across the country, for those who aren't familiar with it, put out a manifesto with 13 sort of high-level commitments that they wanted to see in the plan. And I think when I go back and have a look at that manifesto, and I look at what we've got in the plan at the moment, I think the plan actually goes quite a long way to. Sorry, did you want to say something as well, Kate?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in and just clarify. That wasn't what we wanted. It was called Towards a Manifesto, and it was called Towards a Manifesto because what it came from was the 200 odd submissions that came at the beginning. So you would say that those are reflective of the people who input into that process, rather than saying that they were a reflection of what civil society as a whole, should we know what that is, actually wanted. But there weren't, as far as I'm aware, any big corporations in the room. There were small business people and people who very much care about open governments and who make their business by working with open processes with government, but I'm not aware that there are any big interests in the room. I think the nearest that you would probably get would be all of the people who are involved in Publish What You Pay. That includes a number of quite large organisations in the extractives industry, and they've had quite a lot of buy-in from those companies that recognise the need for transparency in that area. Yeah, so I don't know. Anyone else that was there would like to add to that?
I think what civil society will think of the plan is really up to civil society to answer, rather than asking the government to answer that. And I think the views will vary widely, as we've already seen them vary widely. But the key thing, and I'm also involved with the Open Government Partnership Network. I'm on the steering committee of that as well, as an independent individual, not linked to any organisation. And I think the key to it is to actually, if you want to be involved with the process, get involved with the process, because it's there, it's very, very open and inclusive. Anybody can come along and get involved, particularly from the network civil society side. There are a few people who are just sitting on the fence and just basically saying, oh, we're not going to get involved with anything, we just want to criticise what comes out of the other end. But that's not going to be as useful, and you're not going to have as big an impact as if you actually get involved throughout the process.
Any more questions before we wrap up?
Good question. Priscilla from the ANU. I was just wondering why the mandate sits with the Minister for Finance on this one?
Yep, absolutely, good question. So the government's very keen for a senior cabinet minister to lead the agenda. The finance portfolio obviously has a whole range of interests in this open government space. They take responsibility for a range of things relating to MP entitlements, etc., to accountability within the public service, So that's essentially why the Minister for Finance is leading, wanted a senior minister to lead, and also a minister that has, I guess, as the Minister for Finance, he's a central agency minister as well, has a broad remit across government, and can drive things across government. And that's part of the reason as well why it's been supported by the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. For that same reason, we have the ability to really drive things across government. This is a whole of government agenda. If we were to situate it within, there's a whole range of different options, but if you were to situate it in one individual portfolio that had responsibility for a particular component of the plan, there is a risk that it could be sort of narrowed down just to sort of focus on that sort of narrow set of issues. Having it with a cabinet minister, senior cabinet minister with a broad remit means that we can take that broad, continue to take that broad perspective of open government going forward. Yep.
I just wanted to raise one other issue. I was rather surprised and a bit disappointed to see the language around corruption was very much framed as sort of stamping out and fighting and that sort of language. It seems that the thinking behind that is that corruption is a very transactional issue to be dealt with as a criminal issue. But anybody who knows about corruption knows it's a systemic issue, and it's the institutions and most usually all of the institutions that are inherent in the Open Government Partnership around transparency, accountability, that actually address corruption. So in an era where we're actually using, unwinding red tape and actively providing the wherewithal for future corruption, I think we just run the risk that the language is quite wrong there. So just flag that.
Yeah, that's a good point. That certainly wasn't the intention, but we can go back and talk about language.
Well, somebody's quizzing, but I said stamp out, fight.
I'm reading the language here, and I'm not seeing stamp up or fight.
Well, it was in the detail of the plan, maybe. Yeah.
It will be, and I think that's a direct reflection of the Open Government Partnership language that does talk about stamping.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah,
necessarily
so this could be something to feed back. And it's also maybe a reflection of the fact that the way corruption manifests in Australia is different to some other places who are looking at very transactional, low-level corruption on a day-to-day basis.
That's
so,
right.
Yeah.
No, I agree.
That's a good point. Great. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming along today. Like I said, we're happy to hang around for a little bit as well, so if anyone wants to come up for a conversation afterwards, we're more than happy to have a chat. Thanks very much.